Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos, todas. So we're about to start this amazing event. I'm going to be speaking in English, but we have translation on the back. Buenos días a todos y todas. Vamos a empezar el evento. Si alguien requiere traducción, voy a hablar en inglés, pero los radios están en la parte de atrás de la sala. It's a great pleasure to be here today in Santa Marta. And as a Colombian, I'm very proud that this event is happening here. And also really proud to be sharing the table with these amazing women that we've been meeting before these conversations, but also during this event. So very inspiring to be here with you all today. My name is Maria Perez, and I'm representing PeaceBoat, an international organization that is working in peace building and demilitarization. So for me, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here today. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation. They're here. Thank you for supporting this in making this event possible. And also I want to acknowledge all the organizations who have come together to organize this discussion, including WILPF, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, CEOs, and LIMPAL. Today's conversations invite us to look more deeply at the systems shaping our world and our responses to the climate crisis. When we talk about just transition, we often focus on energy systems, finance, and technology. But a truly just transition also requires us to examine power, security, and the structures that determine who lives and protects in the protected areas and who are put under risks. This is especially urgent in the current global situation context. We're witnessing escalating violence and injustice across the world, including the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the war of aggression in Iran, and the continued war in Dividend. These are not isolated crises. They are interconnected and rooted in system and normalized militarism, uphold domination, and treat central lives inexpendable. This is where the link between fossil fuel and militarism becomes critical. Militarism is not only about arms and weapons. It's an organized system that prioritizes domination, destruction, and control over care, cooperation, and justice. Rooted in patriarchal power structures, it fuels conflict, depends on equality, and sustains a very fossil fuel economy that is driven by the climate crisis. At the same time, it diverts vast public resources, trillions of dollars, away from the climate solutions, adaptation efforts, and community resilience that are urgently needed. From a feminist perspective, these raise fundamental questions about security. What does it mean to be safe in a warring world? Who defines security, and whose security is prioritized? A feminist just transition challenges us to shift systems of violence and extraction towards systems of grounded in care, equity, and collective well-being. Demilitarization, then, is not just a side issue. It's essential to climate justice. Redirecting resources from military spending towards a just energy transition is not only necessary, it's transformative. It opens the possibility for a different future, one rooted in peace rather than conflict. In this context, we will also explore how the Fossil Fuel Treaty can be understood not just as a climate framework, but as a pathway to peace. By addressing the root drivers of conflict, including fossil fuel dependence and resources extraction, it offers a vision for global cooperation and just phase out of fossil fuels. We're joined today by an incredible group of speakers, bringing experts insights, activists' perspectives, and grassroots experiences from different regions of the world. So let's all start the conversation today. So my first speaker, I want to introduce to Ellie Kinney from CEOs. And she's going to be she's focused on environmental impact and our conflict, including military mission and the ways militaries continue to remain largely absent in informal climate accountability frameworks. Today, Ellie will help us understand the scale of military missions, why militaries remain except for invisible within any climate processes, and what accountability should look like moving forward. Ellie, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, hola. I'll be speaking in English. You don't have to hear me attempt to speak Spanish. And just a big thank you to the translators in advance, trying to keep up with a regional British accent. Firstly, yeah, a really big thank you for the invitation to speak here, for the organisers, and to Heinrich Böll Stiftung for bringing militarism into the conversation here in Santa Marta. Also, it's delightful to be on the opposite of a normal, an all-female panel. Fantastic. As the first speaker, I suppose it is my role here to kind of set the scene a little bit, provide a bit of understanding about how militarism is driving climate breakdown, the sort of scale that we're talking about here, and just think a little bit about why this is a conversation that we need to have here today in Santa Marta. So there's no getting away from the fact that wars are damaging. They serve to be destructive in nature, and what we're starting to understand now is quite how climate breakdown fits into this, adding to the immediate humanitarian impact, which we know is already far too high. The Initiative on Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War estimate that 4 years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has contributed the same emissions as France produces in a single year. And we've all seen the devastating images coming out of Gaza, a televised genocide in which over 70,000 people have lost their lives so far, at least. And researchers have estimated that this bombardment has resulted in 31 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And here you can see up here how the vast majority of this comes not from kind of the war fighting itself, but from post-conflict reconstruction that is going to need to happen when so much of Gaza has been leveled to the ground. And it would be amiss here not to talk about Iran, where the environmental impacts of the war have been laid out so clearly for us, from the plumes of black smoke to the toxic rain falling on innocent civilians in Iran. An estimated 5 million tons of CO2 equivalent has been produced in just 14 days of this war, and the attacks have continued since this first fortnight. And the larger climate impact of this is likely lies in the kind of indirect impacts, which we've been talking about here. The country's looking to coal to fill supply gaps, triggered by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And yeah, we're yet to really see how this develops. But across these 3 examples, and they are just 3 examples, and they're each very different conflicts, but what we have here in each of these cases are emissions which are eating into our remaining carbon budget and dragging out the humanitarian costs of war, not just from the immediate consequences that we can see, but in terms of longer term climate breakdown too. And it's not just war fighting itself which drives climate breakdown. Militaries are responsible for an estimated 5.5% of global emissions, and that figure does not include war fighting. And that, to put that into context a little bit, that's more emissions than the entire continent of Africa produces. The everyday running of military bases, training exercises, and of course the military-industrial complex, which supports it all, are all energy intensive. And governments on the pre-war footing are pumping money into their militaries at the moment. Decisions which have a climate cost long before any equipment is even used. For example, NATO has increased the military spending of its members to 5% of GDP as a target. And in the EU, the Rearm Europe project has seen around 800 billion euros mobilised for European armies. Now, CEOBS and partners examined the carbon footprint of these decisions, and we found that this is set to trigger an additional 200 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent every year. And when you factor in the cost of kind of environmental and social impact of these, things like the impact of health and damage to infrastructure, the bill for this adds up to around $298 billion of climate damage every year. That doesn't really sound like security to me. Now, you might have noticed that I've used the word estimation quite a lot here, and that's because, in truth, we don't know the full scale of the military's contribution to global emissions, because they don't have to report their emissions. So a little history lesson for those of you who don't know. Back in the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol, the US said that they would not sign up unless militaries were specifically exempt from reporting obligations. They're concerned that climate commitments may harm military readiness. So military exemptions were specifically written into the Kyoto Protocol. The US never signed up anyway. Fast forward to the Paris Agreement, and this exemption was lifted, but it wasn't replaced with any meaningful obligation to report. So this kind of potential voluntary reporting that we now see means that the data that does get reported, it's kind of patchy, it's incomplete, or it's simply missing altogether. And you can dig into this on our website, militaryemissions.org. And this permeates throughout the UNFCCC. You'll not find reducing the climate impact of militaries addressed in a single NDC. And we've got a little bit more of that coming out this year. Now, I talk about the climate impact of militarism quite a lot. I tend to be the bearer of bad news on a panel, I tend to bring the bad vibes. But here, that's actually not the case. Here, I get to be a little bit optimistic, cautiously, because we have a really big opportunity here. Back in Kyoto, the UNFCCC's consensus model meant that you had to stoop to the lowest level of ambition. Here in Santa Marta, in Tuvalu and beyond, we have the chance to learn from the difficulties of past agreements and break free from the models that have previously curtailed climate action. The coalition of the ambitious here can actually choose to be ambitious. And we can bring militaries into the picture and choose not to give them a free pass again. And I wrote about this recently on the CEOB's website, if you want a little bit of extra reading. So when we call on governments to develop roadmaps for transitioning away from fossil fuels, for many countries, particularly those in the global north, but absolutely not limited to them, their militaries will be the most carbon-intensive government department that they have, and likely the least prepared to break its fossil fuel addiction. Many current military decarbonisation strategies rely on excessive use of low-carbon technologies or sustainable aviation fuel, which simply isn't achievable, nor is it desirable. Sure, there's a basic element of pre-existing technologies which can and should be used by militaries to reduce emissions, but a business as usual approach with the promise of green military technology is not the way forward here. And until governments begin to address the scale of their militaries, their equipment that they use and their levels of activity, they will continue to be locked into fossil fuels for decades to come. Simply put, maintaining current levels of military spending is incompatible with a livable future for all. This is directly related to what we are talking about here in Santa Marta and what is on the table. Whatever process emerges from these conferences has the opportunity to finally push for ambitious and binding transition plans to which we can hold governments accountable. And this has to include militaries. We can no longer bury our heads in the sand about the way that militaries are hooked on fossil fuels and driving climate breakdown. A genuine plan to transition away from fossil fuels use must include a plan to tackle military fossil fuel addiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Fioli. Thank you for putting numbers and helping us understand the fact, understanding the indirect impacts, right? And also the humanitarian cost of war. It's very interesting to see this. I also want to kind of like address that we have many people connected today. So we're also live streaming this event, and later with your emails, we're going to be sharing the presentation. So thank you all for those who are connected from all over the world that couldn't be here in Santa Marta. They're not as lucky as us to be here, but we really want to be connected with them and bring these voices also to other spaces. So thank you for being online. Again, we're going to be sharing the presentation later. Now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So Genevieve Riccaroni. So Genevieve is from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF. And Genevieve will introduce the new report of the Double Divided, developed by WILPF, and she will also reflect on the new CFRE military spending figures that was just released yesterday, and that why relocating resources from war to climate solutions is both necessary, but it's also possible. Next to you, Jen.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días para todos, todas y todos, y gracias a ustedes por venir. I will speak in English in this presentation. My name is Genevieve Riccaroni, and as Maria said, I work with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. which is the world's longest standing feminist peace organization. We were founded in 1915 during a war, the First World War, that also emerged in large part due to a few decades of rapidly escalating militarization, arms race, driven by colonialist countries who were competing with each other to violently take over the lands of others. And that war also resulted in a rapid restructuring of the world order, enabling colonial extraction of labor, resources, and wealth, including fossil fuels. And I think these histories are really instructive for us in this moment, where we are also seeing a new global arms race that is accelerating at record speed. And it also points to the fact that many of the root causes of what people are living through today are the same: militarism, imperialism, patriarchal power, and extractivism, among others. And so I know that Dervla will also talk about the treaty as a tool for peace, and I'll do the same, but armed conflict is at its highest global level since the end of the Second World War. There are around 60 different armed conflicts in our world, and 1 in every 70 people is forcibly displaced due to conflict and violence. From the ongoing dispossession, occupation, and genocide against the Palestinian people, to the US and Israel's war on Iran and Lebanon, to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to the fact that also there are many cycles of conflict and violence for decades in countries like Afghanistan, Congo, Myanmar. These are deeply linked to minerals, to land, to patriarchal power, and these interlocking systems, including militarism. So I'm here to present a new report that WILPF is so proud to have written with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. The report was written by me and by my brilliant colleague, Katrin Geyer, who leads WILPF's work on environment and ecological justice, and would be probably a better place than me to talk about a lot of its contents, and I hope I can do it justice. The report is called The Double Dividend: How Reducing Military Spending Can Finance a Just Transition, the Fossil Fuel Treaty as a Tool for Justice and Peace. In this report, we argue that demilitarization, by reallocating at least a portion, hopefully a lot, of military spending, can help fund a global just transition, specifically under the framework of Fossil Fuel Treaty, a Global Just Transition Fund, but can also help generate the cooperation for a peaceful and carbon-free future that we need. And I want to say there's a strong foundation for this argument, because this is, of course, not a new argument. And we think that that's really, really important to remember. So one thing we map out in the report is all of the different foundations around demilitarization in the UN over many years. Peace and demilitarization are founding principles of the UN, back to the UN Charter, Article 26, and there are many UN instruments that have documented the ways in which militarism and its manifestation in military spending adversely impact human rights, the environment, women's rights, development. And of course, also activists, frontline communities have also been making this case for a really, really long time. And when we were writing this report, we found a quote from WILPF in 2008, which is, "We must have a paradigm shift in resource allocation. We can meet this challenge of the climate crisis, but only if we are prepared to face the fact that bombs, guns, cluster bombs, and landmines will not deter or remove the threat of a tsunami, a hurricane, a flood, a virus, or a water shortage." But currently, most of the sustainable development goals are off track. 1/5 are below baseline, and the growing gap to fund them is 4 trillion USD, half of which is for energy and climate finance. We sadly have the new figures from SIPRI on military spending, which reflect an increase from 2024. That's 11 years in a row of increasing military spending. And at the same time, those were also the 11 hottest years on record. Those things are clearly connected. World military spending was 2.9 trillion in total in 2025. The US alone is a third of that number. NATO is more than half of military spending. And I want to note that many of these numbers actually don't include the pledges that we've seen in recent months, especially. So if current trends continue, the UN Secretary General has warned in also an amazing new report that was released last year on the impact of military spending on sustainable development, we could be looking at numbers as high as between 4.7 and 6.6 trillion US dollars in 2035. That is incredibly alarming. Military spending is obviously rising for many reasons. Geopolitical competition, imperialism, also due to technological modernization, investment in dangerous technologies of surveillance. 100 countries increased their military spending in 2024, and securitization overall is increasing. And these numbers don't include nuclear weapons spending. They don't include militarized borders and border externalization. They don't include militarized policing. They don't include trying to militarize and securitize the climate crisis. And this is also stark when we see that there's such an alignment between military strength, geopolitical power, nuclear weapons, and fossil fuel extraction. So we have to look at the deeper logic. In this report, we map these numbers against the financing that is needed for a global just transition. It's very difficult to estimate climate finance needs because it's impossible to put a price on the loss of lives, on the loss of ecosystems, of cultures, and livelihoods. But the independent high-level expert group on climate finance estimates that the investment requirement could be around 6.3 to 6.7 trillion. I'm sorry, I put some like graphics here, but I'm also going around in some different places. A lot of numbers, and I apologize for that. So around 6.3 to 6.7 trillion by 2030 might be what's needed. But there are two challenges that exist. Firstly, that financing for the just transition is insufficient, disproportionately, less than 3% of climate finance. And the little financing that does exist is predominantly debt creating and profit driven. So we think it's really critical to look at immediate debt cancellation and tax justice, but also at how existing resources are spent, particularly ones that are as harmful as this, that are putting the entire planet at risk. The richest countries are spending 30 times as much on their armed forces as they are on climate finance, despite this being a legally binding obligation. And yeah, today's level of militarization is particularly dangerous because it's in a climate where the infrastructure for multilateralism, for arms control and disarmament, and for international cooperation is being weakened and dismantled. So in support, we argue that reducing military spending could provide the required financing while also facilitating trust building, cooperation, and diplomacy. In practical terms, redirecting military expenditure towards the treaty's just transition framework could expand resources for renewable energy deployment, worker retraining, community-led economic diversification, environmental remediation in frontline communities, and support a system change away from extractivism, away from imperialism, away from militarism, while reducing military's reliance on fossil fuels. I'll just share here that we of course recommend that countries join the bloc wanting to negotiate a fossil fuel treaty. We are calling for a massive reduction in military spending towards some of the amazing reallocation frameworks that do exist. There are a lot of great proposals around that already do exist, and that civil society, especially in the peace movement, anti-militarist movement, have created already for this. And so we outline those in the report, and also for more collaboration among civil society. So I'll leave with this to say that reducing military expenditure is pragmatic, urgent, and achievable. And I'll quote President Lula da Silva, who said at COP30, spending twice as much on weapons as we do in climate action is paving the way for climate apocalypse. There will be no energy security in a world at war. And I know that many might still ask, particularly from governments, why not both? You know, like now is not the time. I hear this all the time. Can we not fund all of this? Can't we, we need to quote unquote keep ourselves safe. I encourage you to read this report. I think we really try to make the case that even if you believe such a balance to be theoretically possible, which I do not, current trends are making it less and less realistic. The continually creeping military and securitized budgets are creating so much harm to people and planet, and the inadequate financing for climate justice and sustainable development really demonstrate that no country has figured out a balance, and a particular responsibility, of course, on the global north countries, the highly militarized countries. No one has figured out a balance that can take our planet back from the brink of destruction. Instead, we're in a pressure cooker of insecurity, violence, and destruction. So we want to see courage on this, and for us to chart a new path towards economies of peace, care, and well-being. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Free Palestine. Palestina libre. Gracias.
And I know it's pretty hard to understand all these numbers in such a short time, but I think we have we have some photocopies going around with the full report. For those online, we're also sending the links in the chat. So please find the information there of the reports and the information that we're sharing here. So those online are also connected with us here with this. So we have photocopies here. You will have time to talk to the speakers later. But thank you, Genevieve, for putting numbers in. Why numbers matter, right? Also understanding, you pointed out that nuclear weapons is not the report. And just to make a note, right now in New York, there's the NPT conference, the Non-Proliferation Treaty happening right now, which is really important. We were connected yesterday, and how we also want to make the connection with nuclear weapons, nuclear energy into these specific conversations. So thank you for pointing out that as well. Our third speaker, amazing, also very amazing to hear from Deirdre Richardson from Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative today. So Deirdre has been active in global conversations about the Fossil Fuel Treaty and his role in securing a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. Today, she will explore how Fossil Fuel Treaty can also be understood as a pathway to peace, addressing not only climate breakdowns, but also root causes in conflicts tied to fossil fuel dependence. Over to you.
Gracias, hola, buenos días. I'm sorry, I'm also going to be speaking in English. No hablo mucho español. But yeah, my name is Deirdre Richardson, and I work on European policy advocacy and campaigns with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And for everyone who has been looking much forward to this event, you will know I was a recent addition. So I just want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Amira Sawas, who contributed to the political vision of this report launched today. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, and she's very sorry to miss it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me in her place. I wanted to begin by speaking a bit about the context of the conference and the importance of having a legally binding framework to control the global phase out of fossil fuels. So the Santa Marta Conference itself is a historic turning point in climate diplomacy. For 3 decades, global climate negotiations have focused on managing the symptoms of the crisis, emissions, while ignoring its root cause, the unchecked proliferation of oil, gas, and coal. Polluter influences have blocked progress, and this inaction has fueled a devastating polycrisis. Climate breakdown, driving unprecedented impacts on biodiversity, communities, lives, and livelihoods. Economic instability from volatile energy markets and debt entrapments, and conflicts over outdated, finite resources. These are not separate issues, they are interlinked fires, all sparked by fossil fuel dependence. And this moment offers a unique, decisive opportunity to strengthen multilateral cooperation by finally confronting these interconnected crises at their shared source. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty is the essential tool to make this happen, a binding international framework to drive a global just transition to decentralized, accessible, renewable energy for all by stopping the expansion of fossil fuels and managing an equitable phase-out. By championing the treaty, leaders can move from empty pledges to enacting coordinated solutions. Accelerating a global just transition away from fossil fuels is the most urgent act of courage of our time and a foundation for lasting peace, security, and the protection of all peoples and the planet that we share. And our dependence on fossil fuels funds imperialist wars while digging humanity's grave. The choice is clear: electrified nations that power justice and progress, or petrostates that weaponize markets and chain us into the past, increasing conflict and climate chaos. Fossil fuels are the primary driver of climate change, and the continued extraction and use are pushing us towards a future marked by environmental catastrophe. And speaking in my role as a Europe campaigner, the Santa Marta Conference comes at a moment when Europe is once again confronted with the reality of its energy vulnerability, as geopolitical tensions and ongoing wars continue to expose the fragility of its dependence on imported fossil fuels. They're definitely not important. This conference represents an important opportunity to advance international cooperation towards a more stable, just, and secure energy future. Transitioning away from fossil fuels is no longer only a climate and environmental imperative, but central to the European Union's economy, security, and strategic autonomy. And the EU's energy import dependency rate is close to 60%, making it one of the world's largest net importers of fossil fuels and exposing member states to geopolitical conflicts, price volatility, supply disruptions, and ultimately diminishing the well-being of EU citizens. And the diversification of fossil fuel suppliers is not a solution. Shifting away from Russian imports has been accompanied by increased reliance on other providers, perpetuating exposure to external shocks. And to take a note made in a statement by Oil Change International, the fossil fuel industry is culpable in death and destruction around the world, not only through the climate crisis they cause, but through the violence they fuel. Research undertaken by the Fossil Fuel Treaty and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has shown that the relationship between fossil fuels and conflict is not isolated and involves the interplay of a range of intersecting social, economic, political, and environmental factors. But there are striking trends of correlation, and an estimated 25 to 50% of all interstate wars have been linked to oil since 1973. And in October 2023, Israel awarded 12 gas exploration licenses in occupied Palestinian waters to 6 fossil fuel companies. And to quote Ali Rosenbluth, Oil Change International US campaign manager, the fossil fuel industry is not just destroying our planet, it is actively profiting from genocide. And as an Irish person, I wanted to speak briefly to something that is often overlooked when we talk about the violence and conflict fueled by fossil fuels, and that is the devastating effects of fracking against communities across the globe. I wanted to speak about the communities in the United States specifically subject to this, the reason being that in Ireland we banned fracking because cardiovascular diseases, strokes, fertility issues, diabetes, cancers, and premature death caused by fracking. So why should we benefit from the suffering of affected communities if it is a fate we are not willing to impose on our own people? Yet Ireland and many other countries are buckling under the pressure imposed by the United States to perpetuate these violent systems that continue the extraction and use of fossil fuels. And it is not right to speak about the US without directly speaking about its attacks in Venezuela, its active role in the genocide in Gaza, and its violent assault in Iran. And I wanted to acknowledge here also that the emissions from war are not counted, as mentioned by Ellie earlier. And with the US exiting not only climate agreements, but international multilateral instruments left, right, and center, we need a mechanism now more than ever to address the culprit of the climate crisis, the root cause of these wars, this violence and the genocide, and the Fossil Fuel Treaty can act as that tool, an essential climate tool for peace. And we are hopeful that Santa Marta can act as a space to advance this important proposal and to move us closer to a world free from fossil fuels. Gracias.
Thank you, Deborah, for basically emphasizing in that is an important mechanism for cooperation, but it's also an essential climate tool for peace. Very important to have it. I also want to use the opportunity to thank all your team because they're been helping us in the organizing this event. They're helping getting everyone around. So thank you all the team from the treaty for being here today. Being so good. Yeah. Our next speaker being in Colombia, it's really important to have also the local voices. So Andrea Castillo Olarte from LIMPAL. Andrea coordinates the line of work on peace and demilitarization in LIMPAL. Andrea will bring a very essential perspective from Colombia, where the realities of conflict, extractivism, and environmental injustice are deeply interconnected. She will also help us ground this conversation in regional experiences and feminist peace-building perspectives in Colombia. Bienvenida, Andrea. Andrea va a hablar en español. Andrea is going to be speaking in Spanish, so if you need your radios, please find them at the back of the room. Bienvenida, Andrea.
Buenos días, saludos a todos, todas y todes. Muchas gracias. Siempre celebraremos estos espacios en donde podemos convocar la diversidad de voces que necesitamos en un tiempo de colapso y crisis climática. Ante el colapso planetario no tenemos otra opción que juntarnos y juntar nuestras voces. Por eso celebro profundamente que hoy estemos aquí en Colombia, en un lugar como Santa Marta, en el corazón del mundo, para pensar otras posibilidades, para imaginar un futuro distinto. un futuro que en todo caso tenga que ser despatriarcalizado, desfosilizado y por supuesto desmilitarizado. LIMPAL es una organización que por más de 27 años en Colombia ha trabajado por posicionar la agenda de defensa de derechos humanos de las mujeres en todas sus diversidades y con una línea de trabajo a partir del ecofeminismo y el antimilitarismo, buscando apoyar y apalancar los procesos de las mujeres defensoras de la tierra y el territorio en diferentes regiones aquí en Colombia. Así que, por supuesto que lo que presento hoy es un trabajo que hemos venido desarrollando en los últimos años desde estas agendas, pero que reúne la voz de las mujeres en territorios como el Meta, San José del Guaviare, Cauca, el sur del país, Bolívar en la parte norte del país, y que básicamente lo que analizamos, lo que discutimos y lo que reflexionamos allí es a partir de sus vivencias cotidianas. Las compañeras han hecho un balance muy aterrador, con base en los números y con base en unos análisis que además a futuro pues el proyecto es terrible, ¿no? Pensar que a 2029 el dinero que se va a destinar en armas, el dinero que se va a destinar en protección y seguridad militar pues esté tan sobredimensionado parece no tener salida. Y es importante este tipo de análisis, pero a ello hay que sumarle también el análisis de los impactos del militarismo en lo cotidiano, en las interacciones, en las interrelaciones de las mujeres y en general como de los seres humanos con los territorios. Y por ello es que buscamos un poco ampliar estos debates y estas discusiones, como decimos también, más allá del número, más allá de la cifra. Y justo en un país como Colombia, que por varios años ha sido decretado como uno de los países más peligrosos para ser defensoras y defensores del medio ambiente. Eso nos dice algo más allá de la cifra. Como siempre decimos, necesitamos poner piel a los números, necesitamos ponerle rostro a aquellos números que vienen siendo afectados por justo el militarismo. Quisiéramos arrancar justamente con un primer elemento y es que el militarismo y este complejo militar fósil y este petromilitarismo, como lo hemos llamado, tiene unos efectos diferenciales sobre las mujeres, sobre las niñeces y sobre las comunidades que históricamente han sido vulneradas. Y es un asunto que no podemos obviar, que hay unas afectaciones diferenciales en estas poblaciones, en donde las violencias cometidas por estos sistemas militarista, extractivista, de saqueo, tienen algo en común, y es que justamente ha reducido los territorios y los cuerpos, particularmente de las mujeres, a objetos, ha cosificado los cuerpos para poder cumplir sus propósitos. Un modelo como un modelo petromilitar necesita garantizar la distribución del petróleo, necesita garantizar carreteras libres para poderlo mover y necesita garantizar inversión extranjera. Y eso es justamente la base de esta triada, como la hemos llamado, esta triada entre patriarcado, entre mecanismo fósil, extractivismo y militarismo. En este sistema, las violencias contra las mujeres no podemos seguirlas llamando como efectos colaterales o daños colaterales, porque son daños que son básicamente los que siguen sosteniendo este sistema. Y no son violencias en general, son violencias contra sus cuerpos, es violencia sexual, es servidumbre doméstica, es esclavitud. Justamente en escenarios, particularmente acá en Colombia, y desde esta mirada muy local, si hiciésemos si sobreponemos el mapa del extractivismo con el mapa de la ocupación militar, con el mapa de la presencia también paramilitar, nos vamos a encontrar que son territorios los más afectados, aquellos en donde hay comunidades como afrodescendientes, comunidades afrocolombianas, comunidades indígenas y comunidades históricamente vulnerables y precarizadas. Y esto no es algo aislado ni es porque allí sea donde estén las riquezas en minerales críticos o la riqueza en petróleo, sino son lugares que han sido históricamente abandonados por el Estado y cuya única presencia estatal es la presencia armada, que en lugar de representar seguridad y defensa para sus habitantes, lo que representa es un grave peligro. Es allí en estos territorios, además, en donde hemos hablado de estas geografías del saqueo, geografías del sacrificio, es aquellos pueblos que han sufrido en sus pieles, como decimos, estas afectaciones de un modelo que sostiene unos grandes intereses globales, unos intereses geopolíticos que se salen de los límites de sus territorios. Y por ello es necesario insistir en esas afectaciones diferenciales. Hablamos también de unas afectaciones y algo que se ha estado posicionando mucho, tanto en la conferencia como en la Asamblea de los Pueblos, ha sido hablar de los derechos de la naturaleza. Y esto porque el daño no solamente es un daño que ocurre desde esta mirada antropocéntrica a nuestros cuerpos, sino también al cuerpo territorio, a las aguas, a los ríos, a las montañas. ¿Y quién está hablando de estos daños? ¿Cómo estamos posicionando también estos daños? Porque no es solamente un daño físico, un daño al paisaje, es un daño biocultural, es un daño a las espiritualidades y a las ancestralidades que sostienen, como nosotros decimos, nuestras Américas o nuestra Avia Yala, ¿sí? Allí hay una riqueza de saberes, hay una riqueza espiritual que este modelo petromilitar está acabando. En un segundo elemento decimos que no hay transición justa, no hay transición energética sin desmilitarización de los territorios. En ese sentido, hay una gran complicidad de los gobiernos y como nosotros llamamos, hay una inversión que está monopolizando legalmente las armas y que está monopolizando la seguridad y la defensa en nuestra región y particularmente en Colombia. Sabemos que Colombia es el segundo país en Latinoamérica con el ejército más grande después de Brasil. Nosotros tenemos una inversión en defensa y seguridad supremamente desproporcionada. Anualmente se invierten alrededor de 60 billones de pesos en todo el tema de mantenimiento de batallones, en mantenimiento de ejércitos, en ampliación y cobertura de estos ejércitos y en contraste solamente se está invirtiendo 10 o 9 billones de pesos para todo el tema de la transición climática y para todo el tema del cuidado del ambiente. Esto quiere decir que Colombia, y puedo hablar incluso en perspectiva regional, se invierte hasta 5 o 6 veces más en guerra y en mantener ejércitos que en mantener nuestro territorio y en mantener nuestras aguas, nuestros ríos, nuestras montañas. Hablamos de un tercer elemento que para nosotras también es muy importante y aquí, digamos, en clave de denuncia, porque hablamos de este lavado de imagen. Como tenemos un ejército tan robusto, tenemos un ejército que hace presencia con labores que deberían ser labores civiles, construyendo carreteras, tenemos un ejército descontaminando aguas, tenemos un ejército a través de algo que llaman bombardeos verdes, entonces tenemos ejércitos hablando de reforestación, tenemos ejércitos hablando de viveros castrenses y de aportando a la protección de nuestros frailejones y nuestras montañas, y es una forma de lavado de imagen, no es realmente genuino esta protección del medio ambiente. Nosotros tenemos desafortunadamente desde 1993 que se crea nuestro Ministerio de Ambiente, tenemos dentro de uno de sus artículos, es decir, por normatividad, el ejército ha sido decretado como guardián de la naturaleza y esto además de que se le pone una función adicional a los ejércitos, pues también hay una exposición mayor en aquellos territorios donde llegan en nombre de la protección de la naturaleza. Además de ello, tenemos en Colombia que el servicio militar es obligatorio para los jóvenes y 20% de los jóvenes que llegan a prestar el servicio deben prestar labores ambientales. Esto también es una exposición mayor para ellos, porque en nombre de esta defensa de la naturaleza, pues también están en detrimento su seguridad. Y finalmente hacemos un llamado, como los tres llamados que nosotras hacemos. No es posible hablar de una transición justa, sino primero hablamos de desfosilización. Y esto no es solamente cambiar de una fuente de energía a otra. Esto no es solamente abandonar el petróleo, el gas y el carbón. Esto es cambiar una noción y una percepción misma de naturaleza y de territorio. Hablamos de despatriarcalización. Y aquí no podemos pasar sin hablar de qué es esto de la petromasculinidad. Hablar en Colombia de petromasculinidad es curioso porque ustedes saben que nuestro presidente se llama Petro. Entonces, ¿qué estamos hablando de Petro? No, estamos hablando de estos hombres poderosos que parecen no tener techo en su petrodeseo. Hablar de su petrodeseo por el petróleo, pero además el petróleo, simbólicamente para las comunidades indígenas en Colombia, es la sangre de la tierra. Pero desafortunadamente, en este contexto de petromasculinidades, el petróleo es un símbolo y un prestigio de masculinidad y poder y dominio geopolítico. Hay una desvalorización de ese sentido espiritual y ancestral del petróleo. ¿En qué momento pasamos de percibir el petróleo como sagrado y como la sangre de nuestra madre a ser percibido como este símbolo de poderío, además masculino, desde este dominio de hombre blanco dominante del norte global? Y finalmente, una apuesta por la desmilitarización de los territorios. No habrá una transición justa, feminista, con perspectiva de género e interseccional si seguimos apostando por la militarización de los territorios como símbolo de defensa y seguridad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Andrea, por traer la perspectiva de Colombia a este espacio. Creo que es muy importante. Colombia es un país hermoso con muchos retos, pero también por lo que dices, cómo le ponemos piel y voz a los números y cómo traer esas voces del territorio y los impactos del militarismo en lo cotidiano. Entonces, estamos hablando desde un nivel global, lo numérico, y vamos yendo al territorio, entonces realidades en nuestro propio país. Así que muchas gracias, Andrea. Our next speaker, so I have the pleasure to introduce Ana Sanchez. Welcome, Ana, from the Global Energy Embargo of Palestine. Ana will speak to the relationship between the fossil fuel, militarized violence, and ongoing struggle for justice in Palestine, including the call for an energy embargo on Israel. This is a crucial reminder that climate justice and international solidarity cannot be separate. Welcome, Ana.
Hola, buenos días. Yo voy a hablar también en español. Y muy agradecida a Andrea justo porque la presentación, la verdad, que ha centrado mucho el marco político de lo que quería decir. Y hoy desde el Movimiento de Solidaridad con Palestina y desde otros muchos movimientos creo que llegamos aquí a Santa Marta, a los pies de Sierra Nevada, a este corazón del mundo, muchas de nosotras con el corazón en llamas, ¿no? Y muchas venimos también de esa tradición política que, como muy bien ha explicado Andrea, entendemos que la violencia que hay sobre los territorios, sobre los cuerpos, vienen de una misma lógica, ¿no? Que parte de este proyecto del capitalismo fósil, que siempre ha sido colonial, que siempre ha sido patriarcal, que siempre ha sido violento. Y es algo que el ecofeminismo lleva señalando desde hace décadas, ¿no? Esa triada de extractivismo, militarismo y patriarcado que comparten una misma raíz, que no podemos hablar de crisis climática sin una crisis de los cuidados, que no podemos hablar de genocidio sin separarlo del saqueo de los territorios, y que son expresiones distintas de una misma lógica, que es que hay cuerpos y que hay territorios que pueden ser sacrificados para el beneficio de otros. Y Palestina, al igual que Colombia, lo demuestra con una realidad brutal. Las más de 72.000 personas que han sido asesinadas en Gaza, cifra que podría elevarse hasta las 700.000, si contamos todas aquellas que han muerto a causa del colapso del sistema sanitario, de la absoluta falta de infraestructura que sostenga la vida en Gaza. Toda esa capacidad de destrucción es absolutamente imposible sin una cobertura y un apoyo económico, diplomático, militar y energético. Israel no puede sostener un régimen de expansionismo colonial, un régimen de ocupación ilegal, de apartheid y de genocidio que no empezó en octubre del 23, que lleva décadas suprimiendo al pueblo palestino sin el apoyo y la complicidad internacional de estados y de corporaciones que se están lucrando a costa del dolor, de la sangre y del sufrimiento del pueblo palestino. El 100% del combustible militar que utiliza Israel para alimentar esos tanques y esos aviones que bombardean de manera incansable Palestina y la Franja de Gaza viene íntegramente de Estados Unidos, en barcos que pasan, entre otros, por el estrecho de Gibraltar y por el puerto de Algeciras en el Estado español de donde yo vengo. Si España hubiera cerrado el tránsito a todos aquellos barcos que han alimentado el genocidio contra el pueblo palestino, simplemente esto no podría haber pasado. El 70% del petróleo crudo que Israel necesita para seguir avanzando ese proyecto colonial que tiene en la zona se extrae de Azerbaiyán y de Afganistán y a través de un gasoducto que está operado por BP, por British Petroleum, que termina en Turquía, es transportado en barcos por unas navieras griegas, otras empresas privadas que apagan sus rastreadores y declaran destinos falsos para ocultar una realidad obvia, que es que están suministrando y beneficiándose del genocidio contra el pueblo palestino. Y el carbón, que también sostiene toda la industria de la ocupación ilegal del territorio palestino, empezó esa historia, está muy conectada con Sudáfrica. Pues Sudáfrica también, pero vamos a empezar por Colombia. Colombia fue uno de los principales exportadores de carbón y gracias a la lucha sindical, gracias a la presión de los movimientos sociales y de este movimiento de justicia desde abajo y una expresión de voluntad política de un gobierno que decidió dejar de tener esta solidaridad performativa a la que estamos acostumbradas a tomar unas acciones prácticas, Colombia desde el año 2024 dejó de exportar carbón a Israel para que siga alumbrando toda esta industria de los asentamientos en Palestina. Pero ese carbón ha cambiado de origen y ahora mismo el 90% del carbón que recibe Israel se exporta desde Sudáfrica, desde esa tierra que vivió en sus propias carnes, el apartheid, que consiguió acabar con un régimen de discriminación y violencia institucionalizada. A día de hoy ese carbón que ayuda a sostener el apartheid y la ocupación ilegal de Palestina sale del territorio sudafricano. Todos estos recursos, como comentaba, no se transportan de manera mágica, no aparecen en Israel para masacrar al pueblo palestino, necesitan de una logística del genocidio. Se extraen en los territorios, pero luego se transportan por unas rutas que están perfectamente identificadas, con unas navieras que de manera regular están suministrando armas y energía. Entre ellas están varias compañías griegas como Kyklades y Tenamaris que son responsables del 95%. 9 de cada 10 de los barcos que salen de Turquía con petróleo crudo para Israel están operados por estas dos compañías. Estas dos compañías también son responsables del abastecimiento por vía marítima de armas a LIMPAL Systems, una de las empresas militares responsables no solo del genocidio en Palestina, sino del proceso de militarización a nivel global. Estas empresas están transportando crudo, carbón y armas, igual que transportarán sillas. Y esto no puede pasar, no podemos seguir utilizando los mismos marcos reguladores para gestionar, para regular aquel comercio que sostiene la vida, para regular el comercio que está gestionando, que está apoyando, que está contribuyendo al genocidio contra el pueblo palestino y a la militarización a nivel global. Por eso aquí en Santa Marta hemos venido a exigir que haya un nuevo modelo regulador que sea capaz realmente de situar en el centro los cuidados y la vida y no como notas al pie, no como comentarios al margen, que seamos capaces de construir un nuevo sistema de gobernanza, porque estos aspectos no son cuestiones técnicas que se negocian en un trabajo, todo esto va de intentar defender un nuevo sistema de gobernanza global que no se construya sobre el militarismo, que no se construya a base de las vidas de las personas y del planeta. Por eso exigimos que se regule, como digo, desde una nueva mirada, desde una nueva perspectiva, que los estados desarrollen unos mecanismos que sean capaces de controlar toda la cadena de valor, exigiendo un uso de destino final a esos combustibles fósiles que están sirviendo para alimentar el genocidio contra el pueblo palestino. Exigimos que los combustibles fósiles sean considerados como un elemento de doble uso. No podemos seguir permitiendo que los combustibles fósiles se entiendan y se regulen como si fueran un producto más. No son un producto más, son productos que están sirviendo para asesinar a personas y necesitamos que hasta que dejemos de depender de ellos, este proceso de desmilitarización, de desfosilización de nuestras economías y de nuestros sistemas de gobernanza tengan unos sistemas de control mucho más exhaustivos y exigentes para poder tener también unos procesos de rendición de cuentas que compañías como BP, como Glencore, como Drummond, como las navieras griegas que están sosteniendo toda la logística del genocidio, rindan cuentas por lo que están haciendo. Como decía, todo esto no son cuestiones solamente técnicas y están perfectamente engrasadas y estructuradas. forman parte de una red. Y aquí tenemos la oportunidad también de construir una red alternativa, una red que sea capaz de construir vida, que sea capaz de tejer esas alianzas, porque si vamos a conseguir esto, desde luego no se va a conseguir en un despacho ni en una conversación a nivel ministerial ni gubernamental. Hemos visto cómo ahora, a pesar que desde la sociedad civil y desde la Cumbre de los Pueblos se ha puesto en el centro la relación entre militarismo y emergencia climática, los documentos finales que se van a discutir en esta conferencia de alto nivel han excluido de manera sistemática todas estas conexiones y todas estas recomendaciones. Si queremos conseguir esto, necesitamos crear un movimiento de justicia desde abajo, necesitamos fortalecer las resistencias y desobedecer, porque desobedecer este sistema que está asesinando, que está contribuyendo a asesinar a las personas en Colombia, en Palestina, en Irán, en tantos sitios, tenemos que hacerlo desde nuestras redes, con nuestras manos. Tenemos que negarnos a seguir sosteniendo con nuestras manos el sudor, el dolor y el sufrimiento de las personas en Palestina. Por eso llegamos aquí, como decía, con el corazón en llamas, pero nuestra llama no la alimenta ese capitalismo fósil que va a terminar por apagarse antes o después. Nuestra llama la alimenta la justicia, la esperanza y la lucha por un mundo mejor, y esa llama no se apaga de ninguna manera. Ni energía, ni armas, ni puertos para el genocidio. ¡Viva Palestina libre! ¡Viva Palestina!
Ana, muchas gracias por traer esa llama a este espacio. Yo creo que es muy importante entender lo que dices, que los combustibles fósiles tienen ese doble uso. Eso tiene que ser muy claro en las conversaciones. Y los mecanismos que alimentan esos genocidios. ¿Cómo lo entendemos? Como toda esa cadena sistémica que está alimentando las guerras, que todos de una u otra forma lo estamos haciendo con las decisiones que tomamos y nuestros gobiernos también. Entonces, Ana, muchas gracias por tu participación. Y Ana hablaba de una cosa muy importante. She was mentioning something very important. Is how we basically work with social fabric, you know, how we build this community. And now our next speaker, Mitzi Jonel Tan from the Philippines. She's bringing these amazing connections and also fire, all this Jama from the youth perspective. So it's great to have her experience here and also bringing the voices from local communities and how the grassroots resistance that we were mentioning before also by Anna can basically fire these organizations and global solidarity. So welcome to this space, Mitzi.
Hello everyone, good morning. I will be speaking in English. I am Mitzi and I am a climate justice activist from the Philippines. And in the past 12 years, we have had the highest number of killings of environmental defenders and activists next to Colombia and Brazil. Just 9 days ago, 19 people were killed in Negros. Among them was R.J. Ledesma, a young poet, journalist, and environmental defender. I would like to start by remembering the people that we have lost in our communities, in the Philippines, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Balochistan, in Congo, in Iran, and across the world, where imperialist wars and militarization continue to take lives in the form of military and the climate crisis. RJ, as I said, was a poet, and one of the poets he wrote before he was killed by the Philippine military was called Protocol, a poem of remembrance. He writes, "Boil water for the visitors, ask someone to charge the megaphone, fold the tarp from last month's caravan, write 3 versions of the press release, check the spelling of his name again, choose your words in front of the barangay captain, leave out the details of the wound, postpone the autopsy if the media is late, return the borrowed generator, draft the statement for allied NGOs, car wash the rented van, Let us meet where we met last week immediately. Brief the youth volunteers on what not to say. Find the cheapest consumable room for 50 people. Photocopy the affidavit, but blur the witness's name. Buy more masking tape. Send the quick response team to the church by the sea. They will talk to Nanay. Wash dishes from lunch. Double-check the list of endorsing orgs. Wash the shirts handed over. Print 10 copies of the poster. Avoid the word martyr in the first draft. Turn off your phone and remove the SIM card. Settle the driver's pay. Change the lock to the headquarters. Tell his mother the address to the body. And this is the story of environmental defenders in the Philippines. When our comrades, our friends, our loved ones are killed, we do not get a moment to pause and mourn, because we must continue. We must wash the shirts, write the press releases, ensure that they are not tagged as terrorists. Because in the Philippines, the Philippine military is the one that is killing our activists because they frame them as rebels. As soon as we release statements and the articles come out that our environmental defenders and our human rights activists and friends are killed, the comments are filled with trolls saying they deserve this. It is filled with trolls saying, oh, they should have known better than to go to the countryside and serve the people. Our fight for climate justice is a fight for life. As our fellow panelists have already mentioned, militarization has always been about extraction, has always been about dividing up the resources for the imperialists. And the empire and the fossil fuel industry that it's built on is dying. And the imperialist wars, especially led by the US, is a desperate attempt to redivide the world's resources in its form, in its order. There are many people that I would like to remember today. But if I would list out all their names, we would spend hours and hours being here. So I ask all of you to remember them with me, whether the ones in the Philippines or the ones you know. Because to remember is to continue the legacy. Because if we start to forget their names, and if they are left as numbers, we forget that the reason why we fight for climate justice is for life. And that is the biggest reason why we must fight against the militarization and the wars across the world. Beyond the emissions, beyond the possibilities of finance, at the end of the day, it is about living on this planet with each other and with nature. And when we talk about fossil fuels and extractivism, we must remember that we cannot have a just transition without talking about demilitarization. Because as Andrea and Anna have already mentioned, it is not just the fossil fuels, it is also the critical minerals. And these critical minerals that we should be using for the transition, that should be using for renewable energies, is going into militaries. It's going into surveillance. It is going into AI that is causing water crises and is aiding the militarization. The Philippines just signed an act with the US, the Critical Minerals Agreement, and they frame it as development. They frame it as, oh, the Philippines, you'll finally be able to develop. But that means that our minerals that should be used for our renewable energy, for our just transition, is actually going to US markets for the militarization. And when we name the US, I want to remind people that the US has 800 military bases across the world. That is more than any other country. I don't know, I think the next number is 4. I might be wrong, but it's so far. And so we must come together now, more than ever, to do everything that we possibly can in all the avenues and all the ways that we can to ensure that the world order that we are creating as the imperialist fossil fuel industry, military oil complex is falling, is one that is based on justice, on care, on life, and not just the life of people, but the life of all on this planet. And may we continue to remember all the martyrs of our environmental defenders, all those who have gone up against multinational corporations, and all those who have died to the impacts of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ify, for bringing poetry, memory, and also for bringing those who are not here with us today. That's very important to acknowledge. So thank you for bringing that reflection, that space, and those voices also here today. I think we really acknowledge that, and for those with that we have lost on the way here, like all of our respect. So thank you so much. So talking about also a minute to pause. I'm sure that there's so many questions right now. So I want a big round of applause for our panelists today. I think we can all agree that it's very short time for such an amazing and important topic. So we know it's very short. We wish we have more days in Santa Marta to have more of these discussions, but the invitation is to follow the links, to follow the different organizations, and maybe after they finish with the Q&A session, we will find time to talk to our speakers. And also we're gonna be sending by email the recording of this presentation, and also we're working in a report. Thank you to the Renewable Foundation. We're gonna be doing a report after this whole conference. The report is gonna be in English and Spanish. So stay tuned because we're gonna be reporting about the feminists and the women's role also during this conference, and everyone is gonna be contributing to that. So starting with this part, I'm sure there's so many questions here. I also want to encourage further people that are connected online. So our team is going to help us to bring those voices also into this room and conversation. So the way we're going to be doing, we can have one question from the audience here and one question from the people connected online. I know there's been some issues with the translation into English, but if there's anyone that needs translation or want to send the question in Spanish or English, for those connected online, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to see your hands raising. Who wants to start? You can see the first one. I'm going to be passing the microphone.
Well, it's better if I do it in English or in Spanish.
Whatever you prefer.
So
They all have radios. Yeah, everything is being translated, so you can feel free to do it in English or Spanish.
no, you just said that there were like some issues. So...
Or for the people online, we
okay.
can translate it.
Entonces, lo voy a preguntar en español. Es una pregunta, yo sé que es un poco polémica y creo que solo lo haría en el contexto de esta conferencia, donde ya todos creo que estamos de acuerdo en que hay que hacer un tratado sobre en contra de los combustibles fósiles, en contra del militarismo, en contra de todo esto. Entonces, por favor, entiendan mi pregunta en el contexto de esta conferencia y en el contexto feminista en el que estamos, claramente es. Pero también es acerca sobre la efectividad de un tratado, ¿cierto? Hemos visto que la legalidad, sobre todo con los derechos humanos, las resoluciones de la ONU y todo esto, un gobierno como el de Trump, un gobierno como el de Netanyahu, para decirlo de una forma diplomática, pues se lo pasan, pues, así como si no existiera, ¿no? Entonces, es más como una pregunta de opinión y espero que puedan hacer statements o hacer declaraciones que las separen de sus organizaciones, pero también es sobre la necesidad y sobre la existencia ya de una resistencia, digamos, de acción directa desde los territorios, ¿no? Nos los muestran las mujeres kurdas, los movimientos zapatistas, el CRIC en el territorio colombiano, pero también es ver o hablar acerca, y no estoy hablando de una militarización, sino también de una resistencia que va a ser necesaria, en mi opinión, cuando nos organicemos lo suficiente para hacerle frente a todas estas instituciones militares, ¿no? Entonces, hay muchas voces también desde las mujeres kurdas que hablan acerca de la resistencia directa desde las comunidades del norte global. ¿Y por qué las comunidades del norte global? porque en el norte global es donde están las fábricas de las armas, ¿cierto? Entonces eso incluiría un sabotaje a las fábricas de armas en Alemania, en Francia, en Italia. Eso incluiría un bloqueo activo del canal de Gibraltar en España, ¿cierto? Y también en Estados Unidos acerca del bloqueo de todas las cadenas de abastecimiento acerca de todo esto. Entonces es mi pregunta, que ya voy a llegar allá, qué pena todo este contexto, pero sí es una pregunta un poco polémica, ¿no? Y es cómo transmitimos, ¿no? O cómo ponemos un marco feminista, decolonial o anticolonial, antirracista, todo esto, a esa necesidad que yo creo que va a llegar el punto de nosotros organizarnos y pues no es militarizar, ¿no? Pero sí es una resistencia activa a esa falta de decisiones, a esa, como esa ignorancia, pues, de todas las decisiones colectivas a las que vamos a llegar, así firmemos un tratado, así los estados se comprometan a cosas que no van a hacer, o que llegue, por ejemplo, como es el caso de las Filipinas, como es el caso de los Estados Unidos, un gobierno abiertamente fascista que no respeta las decisiones de la gente.
Perdona, ¿puedes decir tu nombre?
Minerva.
Minerva, okay. Anyone want to answer the question? I mean, we collect all the questions. Huh? Okay, so we collect it first. Bueno, la propuesta es de pronto colectar 2 o 3 preguntas y luego hacer las respuestas. So the methodology is maybe collect 1 or 2 questions and then get the answers. There's a question on the back. So 2 and 3. So 3 questions from now here and then the ones online. 3 preguntas ahora aquí desde la habitación y luego de las personas que están conectadas.
Bueno, aquí aprovechando el espacio, primeramente agradecerle por darme la oportunidad de hablar. Aquí la compañera resalta la importancia también de ver la resistencia desde los... Y justo levantar la voz por mi territorio, por el Cauca. Hoy justamente ayer y anteayer ha estado hostigado, han explotado un montón de carros, más de 16 muertos y más de 20 heridos que ha dejado la guerra hoy por el tema de los políticos que quieren causar miedo por nuestros territorios. Hoy la niñez, la juventud, queremos levantar nuestras voces en defensa de nuestro territorio. Esta mañana a las 3 de la mañana, justo en el lugar donde yo vivo, está siendo hostigado y ahorita ya hay un montón de grupos ilegales en nuestro territorio. Entonces, como desde de estos espacios internacionales y globales, pensemos también en la protección de nuestros territorios y creo que por ahí lo resaltaban, esa importancia también de ver cómo desde la autonomía, desde nuestros propios espacios, en este caso en nuestro proceso, la Guardia Indígena hoy está en movilización, en resistencia, y cómo podemos también nosotros ver no solo apoya también a Palestina, pero no solo ver a Palestina, sino a nuestros propios territorios, que hoy es Cauca resiste, y el Cauca hoy está ensangrentado, el Cauca hoy está sufriendo, y estos espacios de discusión deberían ser en el territorio, en los territorios que estamos siendo afectados, no solo por el tema de los combustibles fósiles, también por la muerte, por todo lo que nos está afectando a nuestros territorios. Así que yo quiero pues dejar esto aquí y agradecerles por el espacio y guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza.
Por mi tierra. ¡Guardia, guardia! ¡Fuerza, fuerza! ¡Por mi raza! ¡Por mi tierra! ¡Guardia, guardia! ¡Fuerza, fuerza! ¡Por mi raza! ¡Por mi tierra! ¿Hasta cuándo? ¡Hasta siempre! ¿Hasta cuándo? ¡Hasta la posible! ¡Hasta la muerte! ¡Hasta la vida infinita!
Perdona, ¿cuál es tu nombre? Okay, perfect. There was a question here, so we're gonna finish with 3 questions here.
Salam everyone, my name is Kinda. I am Palestinian Jordanian. So I was born and raised in Jordan, but originally a Palestinian refugee. And I want to thank the panel for all what they said today. Honestly, as a Palestinian, I learned also a lot, even though I work in an initiative called or all projects we work in Gaza specifically. And I always say this, but it's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life for multiple reasons. I'm sure you all can understand. But trying to work in an area where genocide is happening, you can't really get anything into or out of the area that you're working in is not really something simple, let's say, or no.
Please.
Okay, so, and as much as it is important that we speak about Palestine, what is happening, I also want to mention two things. So I live in Jordan, as I said, and during the Iranian-Israeli war, basically we suffered also a lot, ecologically speaking, because of the missiles that go above our head all of the time. And I, like, almost a month ago, every 10 minutes we would hear sirens because there's a lot of rockets going above our head. And the thing is that it's not really mentioned how is it affected also for the areas or the countries around that going under war. But one thing that I really want to mention, and I would love to hear for the panel speak about it more, which is Sudan. We don't really usually bring Sudan into these conversation, and I really want to like just hopefully by this question bringing it more and pushing it forward, because what is happening in Sudan is also unfair and it's a genocide, and what is happening is at the end we're all connected. Like our person there mentioned, we care about Palestine and we should also focus on our territories, and I completely agree with that. We need to highlight all genocides happening everywhere. So for now, I would really love to hear like a bit more about Sudan and militarization there from the panel, if that's possible. Thank you.
So I'm just gonna finish. There are 2 questions online, so we're gonna have 5 first questions to answer. Thank you for bringing the Cauca issue and also the Sudan issue into these questions. So we have 2 questions from the people online. Somebody wants to read them? Or-
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
read them. Hello, everyone. So the first online question is about OPEC and the UAE, and what the role of international institutions like OPEC have in fossil fuel militarization. And then the last question is about military institutions having hidden contributions to carbon emissions. And what ways can we address these hidden carbon emissions, especially when militaries tend to be very secretive about that. So what are the best ways we can address what militaries are doing and how they're contributing to the climate crisis? Yeah.
Right. So we have 5 questions here. Just gonna kind of like summarize them a little bit for you guys. So one is about the need, what is the need of the treaty and how we have like a framework, like feminist framework, and what is the active resistance. The second one is about what's happening also in the Cauca and the resistance that's happening from the territories. The third one is about the situation also in Sudan, how we can bring these issues here. The fourth one is about the international organizations or mechanisms that can support the actual situation. And the fifth one is about like addressing the misinformation. The one on that, yes. Okay, so whoever wants to answer first or any of the questions, you can just raise your hand.
Si yo puedo empezar con la pregunta que hizo la compañera primera de qué efectividad puede tener otro tratado más. Desde la campaña por el embargo energético por Palestina, siempre ponemos muy en el centro también la necesidad de visibilizar que aunque nos creamos que vivimos en un mundo dominado por la inteligencia artificial, siguen necesitando de nuestras manos para sostener tanto la industria de los combustibles fósiles como la industria militar. Si los trabajadores y las trabajadoras se niegan a seguir proporcionando sus manos para que esto pase, esto dejaría de pasar. Si los estibadoras y las estibadoras que están en los puertos dejan de cargar y descargar barcos con armas o con energía, esos barcos no llegan, o por lo menos sufrirían muchos retrasos que tendrían unas pérdidas económicas consecuentes que harían toda esta cadena de suministro, toda esta cadena de valor inviable desde el punto de vista que más les importa, que es el financiero y el económico. Entonces, creo que la parte institucional de desarrollo de nuevas políticas que creen también unos nuevos marcos narrativos en el que haya esta conexión clara entre cómo la industria de los combustibles fósiles está profundamente conectada con el militarismo. Yo creo que es fundamental, pero también es fundamental reapropiarnos del poder que tenemos y no delegar todo en un espacio meramente institucional porque nunca va a pasar, porque nunca ha pasado, porque los derechos de las personas trabajadoras se conquistaron desde la calle, los derechos de las mujeres se conquistaron desde los movimientos feministas en las calles y así podemos seguir uno detrás de otro. Ningún gran avance en materia de derechos se ha conseguido ni desde un tribunal, ni desde un congreso, ni un parlamento, ¿no? Entonces creo que es importante que a pesar de todas las dificultades que tenemos en el día a día, volvemos a una práctica más comunitaria, más asociativa, más organizativa y que pasemos de esa parte de más de las palabras a los hechos, como ha hecho Palestine Action con las fábricas de Elbit en Reino Unido, como han hecho los trabajadores portuarios en Italia, bloqueando barcos que llevaban armas para Israel. Todo este tipo de acciones que parecen pequeñas, al final lo que demuestran es algo muy evidente, que es que lo que no están haciendo los gobiernos lo está haciendo la gente, que si la gente nos organizamos y somos conscientes del poder que tenemos, las cosas cambian. Y yo creo que eso es fundamental, que a la vez que peleamos por un tratado, no dejemos todo el poder en aquellos que lo escriben y que seamos conscientes de que podemos hacer cosas con nuestras manos desde la calle.
Sí, hay que sumar algo más y que creo que la experiencia que hemos venido viviendo desde el 24 de abril que empiezan los espacios participativos es una muestra de ello. Justo con algo que decían hace un momento y es cuáles son los documentos que aparecen oficiales en este momento en la página de la conferencia y el borramiento que hay un poco de de esos llamados a la desmilitarización, sobre todo, que creo que es uno de los temas que pueden ser más controversiales en este momento. Nosotros desde Colombia decimos que los progresistas no nos quitan los militaristas. Y así estemos frente a un gobierno abierto, frente a la posibilidad de abrir canales de diálogo, cooperación internacional y diplomacia climática, es difícil llegar a concentrar todas las demandas de los pueblos, de las diferentes comunidades, de las diferentes poblaciones en un tratado que tenga participación, por ejemplo, como decimos y como decíamos en el subsector de mujeres y diversidades, que sea una participación vinculante. Y pongo como ejemplo esto que hemos estado viviendo estos días, porque es justo eso. Es como hay unos instrumentos normativos, hay unos instrumentos jurídicos que en este momento podemos llamarle tratado, pero también hay unas memorias ancestrales, hay unas memorias territoriales de organización, tal vez como tú lo llamas también de organización activa, y que el compañero del Cauca, a quien agradecemos profundamente que traiga aquí esas realidades, porque es que no estamos hablando de las realidades de la Colombia de los años 2000, estamos hablando de ayer, de anoche, de hoy incluso. Entonces, estamos hablando de esas memorias organizativas, de esas memorias, de esas guardias indígenas, de esas guardias campesinas, de esas lideresas y líderes defensores de la tierra y el territorio, que tienen ya unos saberes, que tienen ya unas herramientas y unas trayectorias ganadas, y que por allí hay pistas de cómo puede ser ese tratado realmente vinculante y de cómo superamos esta dimensión de la diplomacia para realmente concretarlas en acciones situadas y territorializadas que realmente respondan pues a las demandas de los pueblos.
I just wanted to add quickly more on the fossil fuel treaty side, and remembering that it's patterned after previous peace treaties. And these previous peace treaties came from campaigns. And the fossil fuel treaty is a tool that has been built and pushed by civil society across the world, starting with its roots from the Pacific, one of the most vulnerable regions in the world for the climate crisis. And it has been brought here to Colombia. And it is the South-South solidarity that has created this fossil fuel treaty that is about to be negotiated. With that being said, once it's there, it is just a tool in our toolbox. And it is then up to us to use it again and use whatever ways we can to make sure that it's actually enforced. Because as you said, we've seen that in the past, there are treaties, but it's not really followed all the time. And so how do we ensure that when they've promised, yes, we have this, how do we ensure that we will actually put it into place in our own context, in our own regions? So it is about using this tool and using every tool that we possibly can. And sometimes this tool does not fit. Like in the Philippines, some of the resistance movements in the Philippines, especially in rural communities, maybe the fossil fuel treaty is not a tool for them. But if it is a tool that can be used in another country that slows down this crisis of climate that we're facing, then that means our people in the Philippines will also benefit from that. Because our liberations are tied to each other. So if it's helping one region across the world in some way, I'm happy because that means we are also being liberated in that sense. But it's one of the tools that we can use. But we must not limit ourselves to it. But we must also not discard it completely because that is what the governments want. If the governments want us to say, okay, actually, we'll water this down so much and you don't care about it anymore. But if we push them and say, hey, we do care about this because this is something that came from us, then they'll be a bit more afraid to water it down. So it's really now being a stronghold and holding the line to ensure that the fossil fuel treaty is one that is based on the principles that we have created.
I want to add maybe something very short just about I want to also recognize that I as a white woman I'm not the person best placed to discuss the Indigenous participation in the treaty process, but to maybe share some thoughts from different members of my team who are better placed to discuss that. That we, like in the fossil fuel treaty, fully support embedding the principles of Indigenous peoples' participation into the treaty. And in practice, Indigenous participation is being advanced through two complementary pathways. So first with the Colombian government, and then also within the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And the work plan with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organizations that creates a distinct Indigenous-centered space within the Treaty Initiative network aims to honor any communication or existing relationship with respect, transparency, reciprocity, accountability, and taking into account that Indigenous peoples' allies are right holders under international law, including the right to self-determination to their lands and territories and to free, prior, and informed consent. And therefore, the ultimate goal is that Indigenous peoples participate in shaping the future fossil fuel treaty on equal footing with nation states. So I just wanted to share that.
I wanted to share really briefly, I think a powerful movement against war, against genocide, against militarism is so urgent. And I say that as a US citizen. We have the responsibility to be fighting the war machine and to try to dismantle it. And I want to lift up, others are paying the price. Defenders on the front lines are the ones paying the price. And we need to have a lot more courage from those of us in the global north countries, particularly in countries like the United States, that are responsible for the interlocked crises that we are seeing. We need to have a lot more courage in terms of being part of that, all those movements, those resistance, and supporting movements on the front lines. And to that, I think, and thank you for raising issue of Sudan. And I think it's not a surprise that also people who come from communities that are impacted by conflict, by violence, are also the ones lifting up other struggles all the time. And I really am grateful for that. And I think that Sudan is an example where the humanitarian response is so underfunded dramatically compared to other conflict and crisis affected situations. There hasn't been that same level of international solidarity. I think there are probably reasons why, and I think some of it is this like tricky situation around like middle powers and around like with the central role of the UAE in the situation in Sudan, with the gold, which is also so related to extractivism. How to look at that, how to look at the cycles of impunity that have enabled the current situation in Sudan, because it's also some of the root causes lie in impunity for the prior cycles of genocide and violence and war. And so I think we have to think a lot more seriously about that, about how to make sure that our international solidarity is more comprehensive. And I think I'll get Elizabeth.
I guess to follow on, thank you for bringing Sudan into the room. I think that's it's very important. I think, and frequently missing from these conversations, as Genevieve was saying, I think at CEOBS we were really pleased to say we have a report. We've looked at the environmental impacts of what's been going on in Sudan, but only a kind of small portion of this, for exactly the reasons that has been said, is that we have not seen the level of funding to be able to enable this work and attention on this work when we do it. That means that, yeah, we can't uplift it in the way that we really need to. But for anyone who is interested, you can find a report on our website that looks into the environmental impacts of the war, levels of pollution and what that means for people living there and with the health of people living there, as well as the health of ecosystems. But there needs to be more on this. If anyone is working on this, please say hello to me at the end. And then, yeah, I guess to bring in a couple of other points. So the point online around the military institutions and transparency around emissions. I spoke before about the Kyoto Protocol and this removing of the military emissions from that, but this culture of military exceptionalism is not limited to the UNFCCC, it is everywhere. Come from a UK perspective, but in the EU, if you look at the legislation coming out of the EU's Green Deal, there is consistently exemptions for military across the board, which means that there is no pressure on government to put any accountability for their militaries, and it's just kind of passed, no question about it, and that has to change. And that's with my knowledge of the EU. I'm sure this is also in other places, and that's something where it's really critical that this moment here in Santa Marta into and beyond, we cannot let that culture of military exceptionalism seep into this process. It's really critical. And yeah, I guess also picking up on the first point around the effectiveness of a treaty and the things that you need to bolster that from the civil society. Mitzi's completely correct. This comes from the bottom up. And we do need this sort of multi-pronged approach. I think that's really important. Again, to speak to the UK context, the UK has a really active history of direct action when it comes to particularly the peace movement. Who've been at this for a long time, but also as well with the climate movements. But what we're seeing in the UK context at the moment is the criminalisation of direct action. Specifically of pro-Palestine groups, particularly of groups like Palestine Action in the UK. If you were to sit anywhere, sit on a floor, on a pavement somewhere and hold a sign saying I support Palestine Action, you will get arrested. That's nonsense. And it is very much that thing of this culture of cracking down on human rights around protesting and freedom of speech. Yes, starting with Palestine Action, but it will be climate activists next and feminists, and it continues. And it's really critical that we have this plus movement solidarity. But also, yes, that this is a multi-pronged approach, that we have direct action, but we also have treaties and we have legal frameworks, and all of these together build up this support. These are not small topics. We need multiple different approaches to combat different angles. Excuse the military language. We are, to nicer language, we are like an ecosystem, we are ecologies that support each other and feed each other. Yeah, so it's really critical to see how those come together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think to be respectful of the time, we're not going to get more questions, but we're going to have some snacks outside, so you're going to have time to talk to the speakers and maybe raise more questions. And to be honest, we don't have all the answers here. We might not be able to have all the tools for resistance. But I think what we have here is also like the treaty is a tool, but this conference is also a movement. So I think we're just looking forward to see also what's going to happen after here, because conversations have been happening in different levels, in different sectors. So I think we're also very curious and motivated of what's going to happen after, and what kind of development are we going to see in the future in the next conference, how we can measure the impact of this conference. So first, I want to thank all our panelists as well for being here today. And I think just a reminder that we cannot achieve climate change, climate justice without challenging militarism. And we cannot talk about just transition without asking where resources are going and whose security is being prioritized. If we're serious about transitioning away from fossil fuels, we must also be serious about transitioning away from war economies and towards a system rooted in care, justice, and peace. So thank you everyone for being here today, and all the organizations that were part there was an incredible coordination, collaboration, and it's also, this is the way we kind of like have to make the movement, collaborating with organizations that are in different places, that connect with us in different values, also bringing different voices. Unfortunately, I think everyone knows that there were some challenges of bringing the voices from Africa and Asia. Very happy to see also the Pacific voices represented here, that we would wish we had like African and Asians also represented here. But for those that were connected online, thank you very much for making the time. And the conference is like being over in a few days. So use the space to talk. I think the best conversations we say in Colombia happen over coffee or a snack. So thank you all our panelists. A big round of applause. Thank you all for being here today. Now let's enjoy. We have some snacks and coffee here in the back and some food outside. So use the time to mingle, network, and ask more questions. Thank you, everyone.
And make you live.
Thank you.